Well, hello everyone. Here we are again. We're discussing Epictetus's Discourses. Looks like Judith and Travis and Jody are here. So lucky me, I'm in good company. And I think we're at 1.10. Does that sound right? Yeah. How long is that one? Oh, it's not too long. How about I do the short one? Here goes. It's called To Those Who Have Set Their Hearts on Advancement at Rome. If we had devoted the same unsparing effort to our own work as the senators at Rome have in achieving what they have set their mind on, perhaps we too might have achieved something. I know a man older than myself who is now the official who superintends the grain supply at Rome. While he was passing through this town on his journey back from exile, I recall what things he said to me as he denounced his former way of life and declared that from now on, after he got back, he would concern himself with nothing other than living the rest of his life in peace and calm. For how little time is now left to me. To which I replied, no, you won't do that. But as soon as you get the slightest whiff of Rome, you'll forget every word of it. I added that if he were granted the least access to the palace, he would push his way in with a joyful heart and offering up thanks to the gods. If you ever find me putting one foot inside the palace, Epictetus, he replied, then think what you like of me. And what do you suppose he did? Before he even arrived in Rome, he was met with dispatches from Caesar. On receiving them, he forgot all that he had previously intended, and from that moment on, he never ceased from heaping one activity on top of another. How I wish that I could be standing beside him now to remind him of what he said while he was passing through, and tell him, I've proved to be a much shrewder prophet than you. So what am I saying then? That man is an animal who ought to remain inactive? Heaven forbid. But how is it that we philosophers fail to keep active? To start with me, as soon as day arrives, I recall briefly what I am due to read over in my lessons, and then say all at once to myself, but what does it really matter to me? So and so expounds his text. The main thing is that I should get some sleep. Even so, how are the activities of those people at Rome comparable to ours? If you look at what they spend their time doing, you'll see. For what else do they do all day than reach decisions, discuss things together, consult about a bit of grain, a patch of land, and other matters of that kind? Does it come to the same then to receive a little petition from someone reading, I request your permission to export a little grain? And this, I request you to examine what Chrysippus has to say about the administration of the universe and the place that a rational animal occupies within it, and to consider also what you are and what is good for you and what is bad. What does the one petition have in common with the other? Do both deserve equal attention? And is it equally shameful to neglect the one and the other? What then? Are we old philosophers the only ones who are indolent and are inclined to nod off? No, that's much the case with you, young men. To be sure, oh, that's much more the case with you, young men. To be sure, we old men, when we see the young at play, feel a desire on our part too, to join them in the play. How much more then, if I saw them wide awake and eager to join us in our endeavors, would I be eager to combine my efforts with theirs? Okay, that's the end of that one. What do you guys make of that?
Well, thanks, Courtney. Yeah, it's a lovely passage, and it's kind of reminds us of all the people that we've known who are kind of really ambitious and who really only get meaning out of being in the center of things, like, obviously as Rome was in the Roman Empire. You have to be in Rome, you have to be there in order to be somebody. And, Epictetus is so shrewd because he knows exactly this guy who says he's going to give it all away and he's going to retire and he's going to live a quiet life. Well, Epictetus knows that's not going to happen. And of course, even before he gets to Rome, he gets some dispatches from Caesar. It's like, he's checked his email and he's required so suddenly. And of course, he forgets all about living a quiet life. But then there's the larger lesson from that. It's not that people should not do anything, and he makes that point really clearly. It's about making sure that our activities are significant, I guess, and it's, as he says, it's one thing, you've got your two questions. I request your permission to export some grain. It's like an official, it's a bureaucratic situation, and it requires some consideration around the legal and the commercial aspects. But is that equivalent to asking, well, what do we think, what does Chrysippus say about the administration of the universe, the whole cosmic questions that philosophers tend to think about? And he actually asks, what does the one petition have in common with the other? Do both deserve equal attention? And for people who are so inclined, obviously one is more interesting than the other. And so, and he doesn't actually resolve that question, interestingly. He kind of leaves it open and leaves it down to the inclinations of the people involved. And the way he concludes the section is also very evocative, I think. He says, we older people love to see young people doing stuff, and we feel energized when we see it, and we want to be part of that, because that's what being among young people does to us. And that's a really acute psychological observation, I think.
Yeah, that's a good point. That the young people are there, kind of probably got their eyes peeled, listening to him intently, and he's saying, "This is great. You guys could be out playing and having a good time, but you're enjoying it here." And yeah, that's kind of the idea, right? How much more would us older men, when we see the young at play, feel a desire on our part to join them? How much more than if I saw them wide awake and eager to join us in our endeavors, would I be eager to combine my efforts with theirs? There's something, like you say, something really energizing to be around young people who are interested in sharing activities with us older people, perhaps. And you're right, like it's not very clear, is it, where he comes down on whether reading Chrysippus is more important than doing the petitions in Rome. I would hazard to say that he sees them as sort of equivalent in a certain respect, because he says here, maybe you'll disagree, but what do you think about this? He says he wakes up and then he thinks about the day and he recalls what he's going to read for the lessons, what he's going to recite to the students or whatever. But then he realizes, well, what does it really matter? What anybody says about the text. The main thing is I should get some sleep. So the priority is actually, well, it doesn't really matter what you do, but it's important that you get enough sleep and feel good, right? Yeah. What do you think?
Yeah, I quite liked the ambiguity of it all. To me, it was just around that section that you just read around how will I conduct myself during the day, because there's a lot of validity in what people of Rome are doing. We have to reach decisions and discuss things and go about our way and decide what it is that we have to do. But then, you say equally as important is the discussions that they're engaged in. So yeah, it's kind of cool.
What do you think he thinks about the man who goes back on his word? And do you think he's contemptuous of the man who goes back to Rome? Or do you think he's really just saying something else, like the man just doesn't know his own destiny? Do you know what I mean? Like, I wonder, I wonder if he's sort of saying we're all called to different activities, or is he really trying to say something a bit more caustic about the man's behavior? Yeah, I think it's not that clear at all, is it?
Well, interestingly, there's a letter in Seneca, and I can't remember which one it is, but um, it's weirdly coincidental, because the guy in the letter that Seneca's talking about was also somebody who was in charge of the grain supply and kept working right into his 90s. And Seneca's saying to him, look, look, mate, you really should retire and start thinking about other things. So it's kind of coincidental. Maybe it's the same person. I don't even know. Could that be possible? I'm not even sure with the timings. But it seems that there's this trope, I guess, that some people are going to be so focused on their career ultimately. I mean, that's what he's talking about. And I don't think Epictetus is disparaging that really. He just says, well, that's for him. That's, he's the kind of person who is going to be focused on getting back into the swing of things around. Interestingly, that, he's coming back from exile, this guy. So what's happened with that? What's the backstory there? And we don't really find out that. That was curious. One thing I just wanted to draw attention to is in section 9, where he says, these people who are doing the important stuff at Rome, for what else do they do all day than reach decisions, discuss things together, consult about a bit of grain, a patch of land, and other matters of that kind. That's kind of like what Marcus Aurelius does in the Meditations, where he kind of takes this stripping back view of human activity to say, oh, there's some people arguing over a bone or whatever, or some children fighting in the gutter. And he kind of views it like, as if he's seeing it for the first time and he doesn't understand it. It's this kind of, it's called estrangement in literary theory, this way that you look at something as if you're looking at it from the outside and you don't really understand what's going on. Now, obviously, Epictetus does understand what these business and bureaucratic dealings are, but he's kind of presenting it as if he doesn't, as if he's the child or the outsider looking at it and saying, oh, they're just talking about a patch of land, whereas might be a multi-million-dollar estate for some investors or whatever. So it's really beautiful literary technique that allows us to see it from the point of view of almost as if it's a child or somebody who's not really sure what's going on. But of course, Epictetus does know what's going on, just as Marcus Aurelius does. But it allows us to see it with fresh eyes, I guess, and that's what the Stoics love to do.
Yeah, and it strips all the status out of it. It's just activity. But look what's at stake when you have to be the kind of guy who does that activity, which is more or less sort of equivalent to all other activities. He has to associate with the people in Rome who just exiled him like recently. So and like, why would you do that? Obviously because there's something more tempting behind the scenes, right? Maybe.
The fellow is older than Epictetus because he says, I know a man older than myself. So, and then at the very end where he's saying, how much more then if I saw them wide awake and eager to join us in our endeavours, would I be eager to combine my efforts with theirs? So is he stressing the idea that, again, maybe, which you've already mentioned, but that idea of the intergenerational, the wish of the older people to still be involved with younger people, to feel useful, to feel involved and to feel active and to feel their life still has meaning. And I watched a replay of Insight, an episode of Insight where they're talking about retirement, and it's relevant to me because I've retired, and it was just interesting to hear the different ones talk about how they found meaning in their lives after retirement. And so some people, like you say, that guy that wanted to work when he was 90, it's hard to stop that wish in people.
Well, maybe you're right. Maybe there's something there that's saying, compared to the man at Rome who goes back there because of the status of the position or something, I would prefer to be hanging out with you young people, and it feels really meaningful to be giving you some of, the things that I've learned from this philosophy along the way. To me, that feels much more energizing and interesting than arguing over grain and portions of land. And yeah, I think you might be onto something there, Jodie.
Because he says, what then, at 12, what then are we old philosophers the only ones who are indolent and are inclined to nod off? And he accuses the young ones of doing that, which I think is a bit cheeky because...
Yeah, it is a bit cheeky, but it's also spot on, right? Because often it's he was dealing with kids of 18 and 19 who, they love their sleep. They're not great at getting up in the morning. He saw that firsthand.
Well done. Okay, who wants to do the next one? Oh, sorry, Travis.
I think you could also probably interpret the start of it, because you've got there in section 2 towards the end that he would concern himself with nothing other than living the rest of his life in peace and calm. And then as soon as you get a whiff of Roman life again, you're back into it. So you could come to the idea that it's just very hard to make a change and stick with what you know, even though you want to move on to this next phase of life or retirement around peace and quiet. But you could probably run an argument too that if you're constantly going with that flow, or you're going into the hustle and bustle, you kind of miss something that is in that stepping back and that tranquility and sharing some of your knowledge and wisdom with others. That if you're just going with the administration of Rome, day to day, whatever it is, then you kind of, there's a phase of life you probably skip, which...
Yeah, an important phase of being an elder in the community, right? Is that what you mean?
Yeah.
Okay.
But I think it does bring out this point that, people, and obviously this gentleman is subject to it. People don't like losing relevance, They don't like feeling that they're being sidelined. They want to be relevant. They want to be somehow valued, I guess. And for many people, that is involved in work, in official functions. And I think that's exactly where the statement at the end of the section, 13, around the about the young people again, that's another way of staying relevant, in a way, is to be involved with whatever the young people are doing. So I think, it's a very interesting kind of juxtaposition of these two different ways for older people to retain a sense of identity and a sense of value in society.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think Erickson had that model where he had, the developmental stages, and he had something versus stagnation. I can't remember what it was, but stagnation was definitely one of the potential negative effects of retirement or that stage of life. And it looks like here that in both cases, the men in the story can't tolerate this idea of stagnation. On the one hand, it's staying relevant by being involved in politics or administration, but Epictetus obviously has a cure for stagnation too, like you say, which is to remain in touch with the youth, and he sees teaching as a way of ameliorating that, obviously, too. So yeah, it's kind of interesting, isn't it? It's a bit of sociological thing going on. Anyway, who wants to read 111? It's quite long. You might have to stop.
Chop it in half, or chopped in half or thirds or something. There's about 40 verses. I had a look. So,
well, how about you? If you want to start, Jody, I'll do the second half. What do you reckon?
All right, we'll do that. So, 1. Epictetus once received a visit from a government official, and after questioning him about various specific points, he asked him whether he had a wife and children. And when the man replied that he had, he went on to ask, "How do you find family life then?" "Miserable," the man said. "How so?" "For it's surely not for this that people marry and have children, to be miserable, but rather in the hope of being happy." "Well, for my part," the man said, "my little children are such a source of distress to me that not long ago, when my little daughter was ill, I couldn't bear even to be in the room with her during her illness, but fled and stayed away until someone told me that she was well again." "Well then, do you think you were right to have acted in that way?" "I was behaving naturally," he said. "But that is the very thing that you must convince me of," replied Epictetus, "that you were behaving in accordance with nature. and I will then convince you that whatever is done in accordance with nature is rightly done. That's how all fathers feel, said the man, or at least most do. I don't dispute that, said Epictetus, but the point at issue between us is whether it's right to feel like that. For in that case, one would have to say that tumours develop for the good of the body just because they do in fact develop. And in a word, that to fall into error is natural just because almost all of us, or at least most of us, do fall into error. What you must show me then is how your behaviour is in accordance with nature. I can't, the man replied, but rather you should show me how it isn't in accordance with nature and how it isn't right. Well, suppose we were inquiring about black and white. What criterion would we call upon to distinguish between them? Sight, the man replied. And if it were a matter of hot and cold or hard and soft, what would be the criterion? Touch. Well then, since our present debate is about whether things are in accordance with nature and rightly done, or the opposite, what criterion would you have us take? I don't know, he said. When it comes to colours and smells, to be sure, and flavours too, to have no knowledge of the criterion will perhaps cause no great harm. But when it comes to the nature of good and evil, and whether or not our actions are in accordance with nature, do you suppose that someone suffers no great harm if he has no knowledge of that? On the contrary, the greatest harm. Come, tell me now, is everything that is thought by certain people to be good and fitting rightly thought to be so? Is it possible, for instance, that all the opinions that the Jews, Syrians, Egyptians, and Romans currently hold with regard to food are rightly held? And how is that possible? I imagine, on the contrary, that if the opinions of the Egyptians are right, it must necessarily follow that the opinions of the others aren't right. Or if those of the Jews are right, those of the others aren't, without a doubt. Now, where there is ignorance, there is lack of knowledge and instruction with regard to essential matters. The man agreed. Now that you recognise this, continued Epictetus, you will have no greater concern henceforth and set your mind on nothing else than to come to know the criterion by which one can judge whether things are in accordance with nature, and then to apply that knowledge in judging each particular case. Do you want me to stop there, or do you want me to just go on a bit further to the bottom of the page? Or
well, that's probably a good place to stop, because it's
a lot in it.
We've already covered quite a lot of ground there.
Yeah,
thanks, Tree.
It is a lot.
So this is quite a this is obviously a very famous passage.
Yeah.
And it's so interesting because the guy is kind of artless and sort of pouring out to Epictetus what's happened, which is that he couldn't bear to be around when his daughter was sick. And you know, I mean, as parents, when we've witnessed our children being ill, it's really hard. You know, it's one of the harder things we do as parents. So we kind of all get it. You know, we get how uncomfortable he was. But what's interesting is how he argues for his position. And he says, I was behaving naturally. And that becomes the kind of the issue here, because, of course, the Stoic ideal is to act in accordance with nature, or to harmonize our activities in accordance with nature. And so if that's correct, this guy, by just abandoning his sick daughter, he says he's acted according to nature. And so it's down to Epictetus to try and interrogate this and see what could really have gone wrong here. And he actually says, this guy, that's how all fathers feel, or at least most do. He kind of makes this assertion without really giving any basis for it, except to kind of obviously justify his own neglect of his daughter. So Epictetus used this interesting argument in response, and I guess it's also pertinent to what has come to be called the naturalistic error. You know, this idea that, well, whatever happens naturally must be good. And so Epictetus is combating that. So he says in 7, well, in that case, one would have to say that tumours develop for the good of the body just because they do, in fact, develop. Now, we know now a lot more about the formation of tumors than they did back then, but obviously it was something that was undesirable and dangerous even then. So just because we make mistakes, does that mean we're acting in accordance with nature when we do make mistakes? Well, no, Epictetus insists that's not the case. So what's the criterion? And so he goes through what criterion we use for other kind of decision making, and then this issue around different cultural opinions. The Jews, the Assyrians, the Egyptians, the Romans all have different ideas around what's correct in a dietary sense. Well, obviously, if one of them is correct, then the others can't be correct. So there must be a way of deciding. And so, and in section 15, where it says where you finish, Jody, he pins down as to, well, we need to decide what it is that is the characteristic that identifies something as being in accordance with nature. So yeah, it's a hugely important passage, I guess.
Yeah, and it's very Socratic, I think. And I think this section gets exploited a bit in A.A. Long's book, Epictetus, and that one on the life of Epictetus and Socratic philosophy. I can't remember what it's called. This idea about, what does he say right at the end there? Now, where there is ignorance, there is lack of knowledge and instruction with regard to essential matters. It sounds very Socratic. And this idea of criterion, well, we came across that fairly much in a slightly different language, but that's what that's kind of comes up in the Protagoras that we were talking about just the other night. But he called it magnitude or measure and things like that. So if you can have the measure and you can work out how to get an objective view of things, then you will be able to make progress in this kind of knowledge. So it'll be interesting to see what they come up with, especially around this idea of criterion, right?
Do you want to keep going, Judith, or do you want me to keep?
Yeah, no, I'll carry on. So section 16. So it kind of comes back to the case at hand. But for the present, this is all the assistance that I can give you in helping you to achieve your desire. Does love of one's family strike you as being natural and good? How could it not be? Well then, love of one's family is natural and good, and isn't what is reasonable also good? Without a doubt. So there is no conflict between love of one's family and what is reasonable. I think not. Otherwise, it would follow that if one of the conflicting things was in accordance with nature, the other would be contrary to nature. Isn't that so? Absolutely. So it follows that wherever we find family affection accompanied by reason, we can confidently declare it to be right and good. Yes, indeed, the man replied. Well then, I imagine that you won't deny that to abandon a child when it is ill and go off is an unreasonable thing to do. It remains for us to consider whether that is consistent with love of one's family. Let's consider the matter then. Since you had such affection for your child, then was it right for you to rush off and leave it? And its mother, has she no affection for the child? Of course she does. Should its mother too have abandoned it then or not? She shouldn't have. And its nurse, does she love it? She does, he said. Should she have abandoned it too? In no way. And its attendant, does he love it? He does. Should he too have abandoned it then and gone off so that the child would have been left on its own without help as a result of the great affection in which it was held by you, its parents, and all who had charge of it, and would quite possibly have died in the hands of people who had no love or care for it? Heaven forbid. And in truth, wouldn't it be unfair and unreasonable that actions that one considers proper for oneself, because one feels such affection, should not also be permitted to others who feel no less affection? It would be absurd. Tell me now, if it had been you who were ill, would you have wanted all your relations, down even to your children and wife, to prove their affection by leaving you all on your own and deserted? In no way. Would you wish to be loved by those around you to such a degree that, because of their all too great affection, you would always be left on your own when ill? Or rather that, for that very reason, wouldn't you have wished to be loved by your enemies instead, so if that were possible, so that it would be they who left you alone? If so, it can only be concluded that your actions were in no way prompted by affection. Well then, was it nothing at all that stirred and impelled you to abandon your child? How could that be possible? No, it was a motive like the one that impelled a man at Rome to cover his face when the horse that he had backed was running, so that when the horse did in fact win against all expectation, they had to apply sponges to revive him from his faint. What motive is that then? This is perhaps not the right moment for a precise explanation, but it is enough for us to be convinced that if what the philosophers say is correct, we shouldn't look for the motive anywhere outside ourselves, but rather accept that it is one and the same cause that moves us in every case to do something or not do it, or to say something or not say it, or to avoid something or pursue it. The very same cause, in fact, that is motivated my present action too, and your own, yours to have come to me and be sitting here to listen, and mine to be speaking as I am. And what cause is that? Is it anything other than this, that we thought fit to do so? Nothing other. And if we had thought fit to act otherwise, what else would we have been doing than that which seemed good to us? Isn't it true then that in the case of Achilles too, it wasn't the death of Patroclus that was the cause of his grief, but not everyone reacts in that way to the death of a comrade, but rather that he thought fit to grieve. And in your case the other day when you ran off, the reason was that you thought fit to do so. And if on the contrary you were to stay, that too would be because you thought fit. And now you're going off to Rome because you think fit to do so. And if you were to decide otherwise, you wouldn't go. In a word, it is neither death, nor exile, nor distress, nor anything else of that kind that causes us to do something or not to do it, but rather our judgments and opinions. Have I convinced you of that or not? You've convinced me. So, in each case, as the causes are, so also are the effects. From this day forth, then, whenever we fail to act rightly, we'll ascribe the blame to nothing other than the judgment that led us to act as we did, and will endeavour to destroy it and cut it out even more than with the tumours and abscesses of our body. In like fashion, we'll also ascribe what we do rightly to the same cause. And no longer will we blame slave or neighbour or wife or children as being responsible for any of our ills, since we're now convinced that unless we judge things to be of a certain nature, we don't carry out the actions that follow from that judgment. Now, when it comes to forming a judgment or not forming one, we're the masters of that and not things outside ourselves. Quite so, the man said. So accordingly, from this day forward, we'll investigate and examine the nature and condition of nothing else at all, be it land or slaves or horses or dogs, but only of our judgments. That's my wish, he said. You can see then that it is necessary for you to become a student, that creature who is the butt of everyone's laughter, if you really want to subject your opinions to proper examination. And that, as you are fully aware, is not the work of a single hour or day. What an absolute tour de force.
There's a lot in that.
So is he bringing it just plainly back to our own judgments? I thought that I couldn't remember whether he'd actually gone into saying that the man had been irresponsible or whatever, but it's not that at all. He's just saying that we all choose our own reaction to the things around us.
Well, I think and I've read this passage quite a few times, and of course, like all great literature, you see new things every time you read it. This time, it kind of struck me that what he doesn't quite say, but what is kind of implied, is that the man was cowardly. And because he's like the man who couldn't watch his racehorse running. And, full disclosure, my son's over in Vegas with Manly Sea Eagles. He's on the staff. And I can't watch any match involving Manly Sea Eagles because it's somehow so kind of, confronting. And so I'm exactly the man who couldn't watch his horse racing at Rome. It's like, because it's a refusal to kind of come to grips with what's going on. It's a form of cowardice, and so Epictetus doesn't quite say that, but that's kind of what he implies.
Yeah, and I think my understanding too, I think after reading Long's treatment of this, was this section around 16 and 17, where he's cross-examining the behavior. Does love of one's family strike you as being natural and good? How could it not be? Well, then love of one's family is natural and good. Isn't what is reasonable also good without a doubt? And he talks about right here, he says, so there is thus no conflict between love of one's family and what is reasonable. And apparently the idea being, and maybe this is a bit different from Socrates, but here we see similar use of argument. But the idea being that preconceptions cannot conflict with one another. So part of his analysis is by showing how these things don't lead to a contradiction. And so, but unfortunately, the man's original opinions lead to a contradiction. And that's what he explored first off. Like, would you want to be cared for in such a way that they left you behind when you were feeling sick because they loved you so much? No, that would be a contradiction, wouldn't it? Yes. So it violates this premise of the preconceptions, which can never contradict each other. And the preconceptions are something like innate ideas about what is advantageous and good, which he then later on unpacks, right? And that's sometimes what I think kind of almost gets missed when we talk about judgment, because he's talking about judgment of something. He's talking about judgment of what is fit to do so. So meaning it's not far from the Socratic language, a judgment of what is good. And once you form a judgment of the good, then your activity or your action will naturally follow from that judgment. And here, instead of saying the good, he just says what's fit to do so. So it could mean like what's advantageous or what's appropriate action. But the point is he was submitting himself to a false judgment of the good, which interrogation of preconceptions, for example, would have shown him it led to a kind of contradiction. So part of the criteria, the measure that he's looking for, instead of like Socrates, who was looking for magnitude and placing pleasures alongside each other in the Protagoras and viewing them not as far away or close up, but together and getting a kind of judge of their size. Here, instead, he's using preconceptions as a way of marking out his criteria and finding out whether certain premises fall into contradiction with one another or not.
It's like he's not giving the man the answer. He's really wanting the man to finally come to his own reasonable conclusion about what he's done wrong. Because at 35, he says, so in each case, as the causes are, so also are the effects. From this day forth, then, whenever we fail to act rightly, we'll ascribe the blame to nothing other than the judgment that led us to act as we did, and will endeavour to destroy it and cut it out, even more than with the tumours and abscesses of our body. So and then at the very end, he urges him, and that, as you are fully aware, is not the work of a single hour or day. So he's throwing it totally back on the man to do the hard work and make his own admission. So instead of coming to Epictetus and Epictetus giving him the answer, he's throwing it back on the man to explore his own judgments and come to the learning that he needs to realize. Yeah.
But I think he's also, this is the bit I love about Plato, Socrates, and also the Stoics, is they've got this idea about what moves us, what causes all of our behavior, and from everything, from speaking to sitting to walking to everything is governed by a judgment about what is fit to do. And that's all. You don't need willpower. You don't need any other sort of psychological faculty. You only need to have the opinion or the judgment that it's good to do so. And that causes all motion to happen as a result. And that's what he says. That's why you're here. You're here because of exactly that reason, meaning you're here because you think it's good to be here. And that's why I'm talking the way I'm talking, because I think it's good to talk like this and so on, you know. And I just think it's fascinating because you know, if you catch yourself kind of trying to do this sort of exercise to yourself, you're like, why am I walking down the street? Oh, because it's good. I've judged it good to walk down the street, this particular street, in the shade as opposed to being in the hot sun because it's good to. Everything kind of makes sense that way. And when something goes wrong and you get frustrated, what's happened? Oh, the good has abandoned me. Something's called into question the good. And now I've got to come to the rescue and try and reinstate the good somehow. And when it gets blocked, I get frustrated and then I start blaming people and this is kind of the whole frustrated sequence of responding haphazardly to impressions without testing them is that we get frustrated and angry whenever we're blocked. And yeah, it's fascinating. It's elegant. It's such a good psychological theory.
Yeah, 100%. And also, there's so much potential for time wasting and energy wasting on speculating on other people's motivations, right? Whereas at this point, all we can say is, and rather than saying, oh, why the hell did they do that? Basically it seemed good to them. But that's it. That's all you're ever going to get access to. It seemed good to them. And that's it. That's all you can really judge. It's so powerful and allows you to let that pointless speculation go.
Absolutely. I was really struck from the Protagoras I was saying before. Just that. It was like a light bulb moment. It's really dumb because I've heard this 1,000 times, but it really hit me. And it was like, yeah, like it just seems right to people. So leave them alone. You know what I mean? It's none of my business. Like maybe you can do something like Socrates or Epictetus and interrogate them in a friendly way. But ultimately, if they haven't been educated otherwise, you can't hate them for that. All you can do is love them for doing the best with what they've got. And I think if you really looked at Stoicism from that point of view, you would get rid of a lot of the elitism that people think is in Stoicism, because I don't think it's there. I think this message is there that you got to just accept people and love them for doing the best with they don't have a really rich conception of the good and that well they do innately and they can discover it, but they just do what, like you said, Judith, they do what appears right to them. And in a way, because they have the preconception of the good, there's something always good about them. They're actually pointed in the right direction. They are good people. They're not evil like Schopenhauer would have it. They are good. It just needs to be clarified somehow. Anybody else want pick out anything up?
I'm just right very back to the very beginning when he says, how do you find family life then? And he says, miserable, my children give me a source of distress, yeah. So it's that's a whole big huge, that's and he then Epictetus says, that's how all fathers feel, said the man at 6. That's how all the fathers feel, said the man, or at least most do. I don't dispute that, said Epictetus, but the point at issue between us is whether it's right to feel like that.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Jodie. And I think you're right. I think basically up front that the man saying that his family life made him miserable is perhaps kind of the key to everything else that follows. Okay, this is the man, the man who says that his family life makes him miserable is the man who is going to not be able to face his child's illness. It kind of makes sense in some weird way.
But it's also grounded again on the contradiction because, shouldn't having family make you happy? Wouldn't that be more kind of what's to be expected? And it makes you think then that maybe what the Stoics are suggesting is that there's a background state which would be normal to have, and that is something like rational happiness or rational joy with the things that you have given to you by nature. So I don't know, but probably not likely that such an idea would lead to a contradiction, but being miserable because you've got a family is likely going to lead to all sorts of contradictions if we interrogate that.
It seems as well at the very end of that text, it's a massive call to action on our behalf, because at the start we have the idea that if something causes us to behave naturally, well, then that's acting in accordance with nature. And then we get no, it's around the judgments that we make and the criteria that we apply to things. And because of that, we have to constantly train and use our own judgment. And there's a sense of that we also have to come to the correct judgment on things, because you could have an argument that, well, the criteria for me is that I don't want to feel discomfort. So when my daughter is sick, then it is perfectly natural for me to leave the room. And then you've got this ordering that begins to take place. And there might even be a setting where the family might be of the opinion that seeing us distressed or not at our best is not the way that we want to be viewed. But then you would have to come in with the idea now that there's probably these overarching judgments and ways of operating, because then we've fallen back to this idea of love and care for the family. So of course you would want them there. And so it's around a constant use of judgments and examining of the judgments. So I kind of wonder where it would have been if it was kind of like, no, hang on, like the big thing for us is not feeling any discomfort, if there would then be further sidebar around, well, there are also natural ways that we should be providing care and attention towards others, and that is, providing comfort to people. But that aside, I think it was just this big call to action around, yes, we have to use our judgments all the time, and that is a constant evaluation of what's going on and the criteria by which we want to view the world and act towards the world.
Yeah, it's and to add to that, Travis, too, and he's also bringing up to the man at 39, just at the end there, you can see then that it is necessary for you to become a student, that creature who is the butt of everyone's laughter, right? So if you really want to subject your opinions to proper examination, so he's in a way putting that man in the category of being someone who does worry about what other people think and other people's opinions, because if any of us were going to be concerned about what other people thought of us being a student, we don't, do we? I mean, we don't care what anyone thinks about our efforts to study and to learn. So yeah.
Yeah, because it's as he says, it's not the work of a single hour a day. It's ongoing. It's forever. Because we're always going to be put in situations where we're going to have to re-examine our impressions and improve our judgment as best we can.
Yeah, and one thing that's strongly implied here, but we haven't really said anything about, is it's all about the good, what is fit, what drives us forward. Obviously, the inverse side of that is there's desire, which moves us, and then there's aversion, which moves us away from things. So he keeps talking about getting clear with our judgments, presumably here so we can move towards what's appropriate and fit. But it doesn't really say directly what we should avoid, which is kind of interesting. Just from that text, what do you think he's saying there about aversion, for example?
Well, he's saying that man was basically full of aversion. He had aversion to being around his child. He had it was possible that he even had an aversion to looking at his own judgments.
Yeah, that's a good point. So if he thought it was good to avoid his sick child, and that's what caused him to run away, then the aversion would be that there's something evil about being in the presence of his sick child, right?
Yeah, or something so uncomfortable that he couldn't face it.
And talking about judgments, though, they're often kind of cast in that good or evil kind of context, aren't they? That's interesting.
But so what's also interesting is that he's come to Epictetus for some kind of validation or guidance. It's as if he knows that he's not done the right thing, and he's kind of trying to piece together how this has come about in a way. So in a sense, I think you're right, Courtney. I think he must have had a sense of a kind of disjunction around his impressions. And so he was sort of groping towards some kind of understanding of that. And that's why he's come to Epictetus. I can only assume.
Imagine, it'd be funny if, like, it starts, Epictetus once received a visit from a government official. Imagine this, Epictetus running the school in Ephesus or wherever, and this official rocks up and goes, just doing a head count, just, work health safety. Just on government business. Oh, how are you going? Oh, not too bad. I got some kids at home. Completely doesn't want to talk to Epictetus about anything. And 3 hours later, he leaves like a total hot mess.
I can so see that, because of course tourists used to come and visit Epictetus' school just to check in and see what he was up to, and essentially get a selfie with a great man. So yeah, it's totally feasible. That's what was going on there. And then he totally got his whole life upended in front of him. So in front of him.
He never came back again.
Never came back.
Shall we do 112? It's another long one, so I could start and I'll go to about 23. How's that? Is that right? That should be about halfway. Okay. On contentment. With regard to the gods, there are some who say that the divine doesn't even exist, while others say that it does exist, but that it is inactive and indifferent and exercises no providential care, while a third set of people maintain that it both exists and exercises providential care, but only with regard to important matters relating to the heavens and in no way to affairs on earth. A fourth set declare that it does take thought for earthly and human affairs, but only in a general fashion, without showing concern for each particular individual, while a fifth set, to which both Odysseus and Socrates belonged, say, not a movement of mine escapes you. We must thus start off by examining each of these positions to see whether or not it is soundly argued. For if the gods don't exist, how can it be our goal in life to follow the gods? And if they do exist, but show concern for nothing whatever, how again can that be our goal? If, on the other hand, they both exist and exercise care, but there is no communication between them and human beings, and indeed by Zeus, between them and me specifically, how even in that case can this idea still be sound? One who has achieved virtue and excellence after having examined all these questions submits his will to the one who governs the universe, just as good citizens submit to the laws of their city, and one who is still being educated should approach this education with this aim in view. How may I follow the gods in everything? And how can I act in a way that is acceptable to the divine administration? And how may I become free? For someone is free if all that happens to him comes about in accordance with his choice, and no one else is able to impede him. What is freedom, madness, then? Heaven forbid, for freedom and madness are hardly compatible with one another. But I want whatever I wish to happen indeed to happen, regardless of how I arrive at that wish. You're crazy, you're out of your mind. Don't you know that freedom is a precious and admirable thing? But for me to desire arbitrarily that things should happen as I arbitrarily desire risks being not merely far from admirable, but even exceedingly reprehensible. Consider now How to proceed when it comes to writing? Do I write the name Dion just as I wish? Of course not. I'm taught to want to write it as it ought to be written. And when it comes to music, the same applies. And in general, with regard to any of the arts and sciences, the same applies. Otherwise, there would be no point in trying to gain knowledge of anything if it could be adapted to fit everyone's individual wishes. Is it then only in this most grave and important matter, that of freedom, that it is possible for me to desire according to my whim? In no way, but rather true education consists precisely in this, in learning to wish that everything should come about just as it does. And how do things come about? As the one who ordains them has ordained. And he has ordained that there be summer and winter and abundance and shortage and virtue and vice and all other opposites of that kind. And he has granted to each of us a body and the parts that make up that body and objects for us to possess and companions to share our life. It is with this order of things in mind that we should approach our education, and not as to change the existing order of things, for that has not been permitted to us, nor would it be better that it should be, but rather things around us being as they are and as their name dictates, so that we, for our part, may keep our will in harmony with whatever comes to pass. Maybe that's a good place to stop.
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Courtney.
It's interesting. I was reading a little short summary by Matthew Gindon. I don't know if any of you are aware of him. He's just an internet Stoic Buddhist person, and he was summarizing Spinoza today, and I was just reading that, and Spinoza's take on all the various strata or layers of gods and gods and all the different ways that we imagine the various deities and whether it's monism or polytheism or and Spinoza's view of the one, the ground of all of it, that it emanates from itself, and which is sort of a Stoic position as well in a sense. So it's interesting to have this pop up here now tonight, me looking at these various categories of theology,
Yeah, thanks. And obviously the 5 different positions he mentions belong to the various philosophical or religious schools of the time, right? Do we want to sort of try and guess which one belongs to what? Is that helpful or too hard?
We could try.
Well, there are some that say the divine doesn't exist.
Yeah, so sorry, just on that, that's curious because basically I don't think there were, well, there must have been next to zero actual atheists in antiquity. And I think that's widely known. So the fact that Epictetus says that there are people who say that the divine doesn't even exist, that's interesting. But as far as we're concerned, we don't really have much separate evidence around that.
Well, the Epicureans weren't far from atheists. They probably weren't purely atheists, but certainly they were.
Well, I think they were the third set of, sorry, no, they were
They're the next.
They were the next lot who say, well, others say that it does exist, that's the divine, but it is inactive and indifferent and exercise no providential care. I'd say that's the Epicureans.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, for the Epicureans, the gods were remote and somehow indifferent. And in a way, they were being pious by trying to become like those gods, which were indifferent and remote and not connected to what was going on around them, obviously.
But number 2, the ones who maintain that the divine exists and exercises care, but only with regard to important matters relating to the heavens, that might be a kind of a Platonist position. I'm just guessing here.
Yeah, maybe. And in no way to affairs of the earth. Yeah, definitely. Some sort of yeah, Neoplatonic or Platonic. Were the Neoplatonists around yet? Not really.
Not quite, no.
No.
A fourth
And then
set
so, yeah,
declared
the
that
fourth
it
set.
does take thought for earthly human affairs, but only in a general fashion without showing concern for each particular individual. Well, that's quite interesting, isn't it? Because people will often think maybe that that's what's going on in Stoicism.
Yeah, so is the are we to understand that this is the Stoic view, or the fifth set that to
Well,
which
that's
both
more Socrates, isn't
Odysseus
it?
and Socrates belong, saying not a movement of mine escapes you. So um that implies a very sort of caring and interventionist deity.
I
And
would
even,
say that is the Stoic view, the
well,
fifth
even
one.
Epictetus follows Socrates, right? Epictetus tends to follow Socrates.
Well, it makes sense because not a movement of mine escapes you. The gods are in everything that we do, you know. It's what do you call it? The divine fire that penetrates all substance and all that. I think that's what they're talking about there. It's not that God is this interventionist thing that necessarily advises you, though even that's a bit maybe because they got the daemon, right? You know.
Yeah.
I thought it was interesting, section 5, where for if the gods don't exist, how can it be our goal in life to follow the gods? That's a really interesting position because, well, first of all, as I say, it presupposes that there are people who deny the existence of the gods, which is kind of hard to actually trace in their surviving record. But also this idea around following and imitating the gods. And that's something that Marcus Aurelius is, of course, very, very strong on. Yeah, imitating the gods. How are we to imitate the gods? It became a very kind of key issue, and but also a slightly fraught one because the Olympian gods weren't always necessarily very admirable in their ethical dealings. so, so imitating the gods. Well, what exactly are we imitating?
I was kind of under the impression though that fundamentally all these schools see the gods as the exemplar that we should be aiming for, right? To ultimately to imitate. And that's why I think Plato was fairly scathing of the way that the gods had been treated by the poets and been tainted with all these anthropomorphic kind of behaviors that made them vile and full of vice. And clearly he was saying, well, the gods aren't like that. And obviously Epictetus it doesn't think gods like that either. But I wanted to say too, I think the fourth set that declares that it does take thought for earthly human affairs, but only in general fashion, I'd say that's Aristotelian, if I were to guess.
Well, it adds a interesting layer then to what we were talking about in the previous passage around using our judgments and the criteria we judge things from, because depending on which viewpoint you take here, you've got the divine providence of the gods and emulating yourself in their manner. So you would be then passing the judgments and forming the opinions, looking to the gods and the goddesses as that sage in a way, or choosing or forming an opinion to act in a way that they would approve of.
Yeah, definitely. And they have a particular version of God in mind because he's the great architect of the universe or administrator of the universe or whatever the language it was they used. So he knows he's set everything in motion and it goes in a certain kind of harmony and rhythm. And it's not up to us to try and kind of decide what we would like to happen. It'd be much better or appropriate to surrender your will to what's actually preordained, or maybe preordained is not the right word, but providentially kind of ordered. But I'm curious about this. It really struck me because I don't remember this. I haven't read this particular translation before, and I'm sure it's not the same in the Dobbins. But he says, "What is freedom madness then?" I don't know what he says in Dobbins, but he definitely doesn't say that. But it's a quite a striking idea. I think I know what he means, and it's this idea that we're mad for thinking that we get to choose whatever we would wish to be the case, right? That's what he seems to be talking about, right? Freedom madness. What a strange term.
No, what you're saying? What is freedom madness? Then you're saying is freedom madness?
Yeah,
that makes sense. I was thinking freedom madness. What's freedom madness? I was like, what's that? I was totally confused. I was thinking, I wonder what word that could be.
Unearthed a new saying.
I like that though.
I mean, but the point, I think the point remains, right, that and it's a really good point.
Yeah.
You know, is freedom simply the freedom to do whatever occurs to you at any moment, in accordance with his choice, and no one able to impede him? You know, so the freedom of someone who's essentially maybe running around with a machete, is that freedom, or is that madness? And I think he's actually saying very strongly, no, freedom and madness are hardly compatible with one another, and they're not the same thing. It's not the same thing to be free or to run around crazily with a machete. Those things are not, they're not two Venn diagrams overlapping with each other. they're not the same thing.
I could invoke Socrates here and go, aha, but Protagoras, you didn't know on the island of whatever island it was, that freedom madness is actually a thing that people have. Didn't you know?
That's funny.
But
yeah, I mean, it comes back to this issue, and it's in section 12. And he repeats the term, and I haven't checked the Greek, but I'm sure it's be there in the Greek as well. He repeats the term arbitrarily, whatever the Greek term is for that. I don't know. But he repeats it. Obviously, that's the issue. You know, just it's not a random thing. Freedom is not random. It's to do, again, it comes back to reason. It's to do with reason. It's logikos. It's what we should be. It's a mode in which we should be exercising our reason, not random kind of, you know, things going on.
Yeah, it's a good point, isn't it? Like, if everybody could arbitrarily wish for whatever they wanted, well, then what kind of world would we live in? It would be complete chaos, wouldn't it? And it makes sense. Rationally, we have to agree to restrict our wishes in order for the world to kind of work in a harmonious way. And he's just sort of generalizing from the social example to the universe. Well, of course that's the case, you know.
I do really enjoy the examples and the analogies that are put forward. I just thought they were great. You know, do I write the name Dion just as I wish? You know, of course not. There's a way to write it. There's a way to do art. There's a way to do music. I just really enjoyed that section, and just and wish I could come up with those type of examples. It's good.
But it's not very woke, is it? But no, it's very true. Do you want to read the next half?
So just before we get to the next half, I just want to in section 15, and it's sort of drawing again from where we've got to and what Travis just said around you know, whether right way, there's a right way and a wrong way to write Dion's name. Basically, that leads us to this section about order. You know, how do things come about as the one who ordains them has ordained? You know, that's in relation to order. It's in relation to structure. it's in relation to the way things have been set up. And we don't choose that there's summer and winter. That's part of the structure of the world as we find it, as we come across it. We don't have any choice around that. So yeah, it's an interesting point around order and structure.
And that whole and I like any time where we get a chance to look at that question of the existence of evil or error, and the abundance and shortage and virtue and vice, those two opposites, the existence of those opposites, as necessary and part of the structure.
Yeah, and I mean, there's an interesting paradox too, in the sense that so there's a kind of acceptance that we've often talked about, and there's for to live like a Stoic presumably is to kind of have this ability to let go of your own I don't know, wishes, your own kind of dogmatic ideas about what should happen next, and instead sort of be open to what happens and treat everything as if it were a gift, because that's the way things are kind of ordered and meant to go. And if you think about what we just read in the last discourse, it was saying the reason you do anything at all is because you formed an opinion that it's good to do so. So in a way, how do you marry those two concepts together? And I think that's where the Stoic methods starts to get kind of complex, and but also very elegant, right? Because there's this acceptance, and somehow whatever happens and whatever occurs, you have to form the opinion that whatever occurred is good enough for me, so that I can move towards it and accept it. But that's really challenging, isn't it? That's a very challenging project.
It implies an openness. It implies a flexibility of sorts, doesn't it?
Yeah, a very profound flexibility, because obviously you're going to have expectations about things. And when those expectations don't pan out, you have to be so flexible that you can immediately drop those expectations and go, well, you know what? I'm quite happy with the way it worked out anyway. And it doesn't thwart my desire at all, because actually my true desire was to have whatever happened. That's what I truly desire.
And I mean, the process involves adjusting one's impressions, really, or adjusting one's reaction to one's impressions. So there's a process there, which may or may not take time.
And it's also about being not only are you adjusting your impressions, but you are adapting to every single moment as the world flows by. So it's like we're in a river and it's flowing, and there's no point of view that's fixed and determined to, do one thing in particular. You're constantly adapting as new things happen, and you're gauging and judging the good as it unfolds in front of you. It sounds like a spiritual discipline when you start to think of it in those terms.
Did you read 17, Courtney? I can't remember. Did you read 17?
I did. So it's up to 18.
About education, how we approach our education.
Yeah.
Yeah. Which is exactly a lovely summary of what went before. We'll go for it, Trav.
Cool. All right, 18. Well then, is it possible to flee from human society? And how could that be possible for us? Is it possible to change people then, if we do associate with them? And who has granted me such a power? What remains to be done then? What method can we discover to apply in dealing with them? A method that will ensure that, while they for their part act as they think fit, we for our part will remain nonetheless in accord with nature. But you're weak-spirited and discontented, and if you're alone, you call it desolation. and if you're in the companies of others, you call them cheats and robbers, and you find fault even with your parents and children, your brothers and neighbors. Whereas in fact, if you're living alone, you should call that peace and freedom, and view yourself as being like the gods. And if you find yourself in the company of a mass of people, you could call that not a mob and a source of uproar and vexation, but rather a feast and a public festival, and so accept everything with contentment. What is the punishment, then, of those who fail to accept things in that spirit? To be just as they are. Is someone discontented to find himself on his own? Then let him be all alone. He is discontented with his parents? Then let him be a bad son and grieve. He is discontented with his children? Then let him be a bad father. Throw him in prison. What sort of prison? That in which he already finds himself. For he is there against his will, and whenever someone is in any place against his will, that is a prison for him. Just as Socrates, for his part, was not in prison because he was there willingly. So I had to have a crippled leg then. So because of one's miserable leg, slave, you're going to cast reproaches against the universe. Aren't you willing to make a gift of it as a whole? Won't you give it up? Won't you happily surrender it to the one who gave it to you? And will you be angry and displeased at the audiences of Zeus when he has prescribed and ordained together with the fates who attended your birth and spun the thread of your destiny? Don't you know how small a part you are by comparison to the whole? With regard to your body, I mean, for when it comes to your reason, you're not inferior to the gods, nor do you fall short of them, because the greatness of reason is measured not by height or length, but by the quality of its judgments. Aren't you willing to place your good, then, in that which renders you equal to the gods? Oh, how miserable I am to have such a father and mother! What, was it granted to you to choose your parents in advance and say, may this man have intercourse with this woman at this hour so I may come into the world? No, that wasn't granted to you, but your parents had to exist before you, and then you had to be born in the way that you were. And your parents of what, and from parents of what kind? From the parents of such a kind as they were. What then, considering that they were such as they were, is no remedy available to you? Now, if you were ignorant of the purpose for which you possess the power of sight, you'd be unfortunate and in a bad way if you closed your eyes when colours were presenting themselves. So when you have nobility and greatness of mind to enable you to deal with every circumstance, and yet are ignorant of that, aren't you even more unfortunate and even worse off? Things that are faculty in your possession is well fitted to deal with present themselves to you, and yet you renounce the use of it at the very moment when you should be keeping it open for use and fully attentive. Shouldn't you be giving thanks, rather, to the gods for having enabled you to rise above everything that they have placed within your power, and having rendered you accountable only for what is subject to your control? With regards to your parents, they have discharged you from all accountability, and likewise with regard to your brothers and sisters, and to your body, and to your property, and life and death. Well then, what have they made you accountable for? Only for that which lies within your power, the right use of your impressions. Why do you charge yourself then with things for which you're not accountable? You're merely creating trouble for yourself.
Yeah, well done, Arrian. Well written.
Thanks, Travis. That's great. Wow. As someone who struggles with, parental stuff, I should keep this verse on the back of the toilet door, really.
Yeah, how good, right? I mean, it's so brilliant. But yeah, there's just so much here.
I should have this whole thing printed out everywhere.
So yeah, I mean, and every one of these verses has got something special. So what's the method? You know, we need a method. Okay, he says, well, but if you're discontented, if you're all alone, you call it desolation, you blame everybody else, right? But if you're living alone, we'll call it freedom. You know, that's what freedom is. And, you know, if people are discontented with a situation, well, then let them be discontented. And so in sort of 24, so I had to have a crippled leg then. Well, that's obviously Epictetus' own situation. But he refuses to cast reproaches against the universe. He refuses to blame the gods for the situation in which he has found himself. And that's kind of key. We see it in Seneca as well. You know, you can be sad about what's occurred, whether you've lost someone or whatever, but to blame fate and blame the gods and blame the cosmos, that's not right. That's not appropriate.
I just found it really striking too, not similarity, the gentleness of Stoicism compared to, say, Plato, really. I thought they were kind of more similar, but the Stoics are way more gentle. Because here he says, you know, so the people are annoying you basically, and how should you punish them? You know, we're looking at around 21, 22. He says, is someone discontented to find himself? Oh, hang on. No, that's not the bit. Where's the bit where he says, let them just their prison is just the way they are.
23.
Yeah,
throw
23.
them into prison.
Yeah,
okay.
23.
But yeah, they're already in prison essentially. They're already punished.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
so kind of the idea being in Plato anyway, you get this idea that people need to be punished because they have to, it improves them. It's right for them to pay back whatever it is they've done wrong in order to correct some imbalance in their soul. But here we're hearing something quite different. Like it's like, let the people be. If they've gone and done the wrong thing, well, you know, you don't have to get vengeance or even punish them because they're already in prison. They've got who they are. That's what they've got as a result of not having done the right thing. I think
they're not living in freedom, are they? They're not
that's
living
right.
in freedom.
They're the ones who are already kind of being punished by their own activity. So it's really saying we don't really even have to add any more punishment on top of that, you know? It seems to suggest that to me anyway. Maybe and to me that sounds a lot more tolerant and understanding in some respect. Because I was thinking about Plato the other day. I was reading, I think it was just in what we were reading the other day, and he's often flirting with the idea of the death penalty when people are really naughty. But this doesn't really come up like that in the Stoics. I mean, I'm sure they're not opposed to it, but because of the culture, but it's definitely not a feature of their philosophy. That's what I'm saying.
Yeah, that's interesting. So yeah, in 23, and he brings up Socrates, just as Socrates for his part was not in prison. He was not in prison. Like, you know, notoriously, Socrates was in prison, as we've seen in the Phaedo and the Crito. But he says Epictetus says he was not in prison because he was there willingly, even though he was, as we know from the text, he was in shackles. So that's an interesting perspective. I mean, I think you're right, Courtney. I think, for instance, the Stoics would not have, you know, say somebody who murdered somebody else. They wouldn't say that person, however troubled, and of course you have to be very troubled in order to murder another person. However troubled, they wouldn't say that was kind of, you should just let that slide kind of thing. They would still be in favour of a judicial response to that. But yeah, I mean, the recognition that a person who does something terrible like that is already suffering is an important step.
Yeah, it's that movement towards understanding human psychology. Throw him into prison. What sort of prison? The guy's already in prison. He's been placed there by his own will, his own misuse of things. Poor guy. What more could you do to him? And that connection to Protagoras again from what we read the other day in 26. Don't you know how small a part you are by comparison to the whole with regard to your body? Well, then he says, you're not inferior to the gods, nor do you fall short of them, because the greatness of reason is measured not by height or length, but by the quality of its judgments. I mean, I saw that again as more talk about measure and that sort of thing.
Yeah, I totally agree. I'm sure that's a reference to Pythagoras for sure. But interesting, and I thought the next section was also really interesting. People so often complain about, their parents or whatever, and Epictetus reminds us, well, no, we didn't get to choose when we were born, the parents we were born to. No, we didn't get to choose that, but nobody does, right? It's just they were of such a kind as they are. That's something we have to accept. It's not something we should go through our lives being anxious about or being worked up about. Our parents were as they were, and part of the reason our parents were as they were was how their parents was they were, and the world that they grew up in was what they faced. It's so profound, I think, what Epictetus says here, because it's so easy for people to go through life blaming their parents, and of course, the whole Freudian system gave an increased impetus to that, which we're still seeing the kind of aftershocks of, even though the actual Freudian system may not be so much followed, but the whole impetus of it was around essentially blaming our parents for the way things are with us. Whereas Epictetus points out, look, that was just one aspect of how we came about, and it doesn't make any sense to blame them for however we find ourselves.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I was thinking about this. I was at the men's group yesterday, and two or three of the men were really, really giving themselves a hard time about how they thought they were such bad parents, but they clearly weren't. They're really loving dads, but they were really, really bullying themselves about just regrets and things. And it made, this makes me think of that too. It's like, well, yeah, in a sense, you're accountable to your children. You got to look after them and that. But you have to draw the line. You have to let your kids grow up and be themselves. Even, kids are more resilient than often we parents think that they are, and they need to have some um discomfort. So, you can't be there for them all the time and get them out of trouble all the time. And that would probably be inappropriate. We shouldn't make our children's burdens our own completely. I think that's the wrong attitude. I think we should be there to love and support them, but they need enough independence to be able to solve their problems for themselves too. And I think Winnicott kind of, who was a psychoanalyst, he said that I think he wrote a book called The Good Enough Mother. And it was a kind of rebuttal against that women thought they had to be perfect mothers and they were guilt tripping themselves and that. And he was like, no, you don't. Nature just requires you to be loving and supportive. You don't have to bully yourself in that way. It's just not healthy. Just be a good enough parent. That's really that's good. It's good enough.
Yeah, the judgments we make about what we are accountable for or not accountable for. The last verse is lovely, 35. Why do you charge yourself then with things for which you're not accountable? You're merely creating trouble for yourself. Yeah, which is exactly what you're saying, Courtney.
And I was very interested in it as well from the context of, we're in the time and place and context that we are. And this idea of, accepting the world for what it is, because we're unable to choose all of these things. And, going back to Epictetus's example, I kind of, in my mind, was thinking even further with the case of, okay, well, maybe we all, if we had our way, would have been born into a very comfortable and rich life. And we all have varying degrees of circumstances and things that we have to overcome. And then I think that someone also had to be Hercules. So we all have a part to play, even if we don't want to be in that situation or role.
Yeah, that's a good
Just something I was thinking of.
That's a good point. And ultimately, like you said before, Judith, going back one discourse or two, whether you're reading Chrysippus and you're working in a school, or whether you're the guy who's counting out the grain, or whether you're an Achilles or a farmer, it doesn't really matter because, we've got the same share in reason as the gods. So the rest of it is just you doing your thing, doing your life, living the life that's given to you. We all have equal share in that treasure, in a sense.
That seems a good place to kind of wrap it up. I will just say, I will just mention section 32, where Epictetus gets into a more elevated register, and he says, well, shouldn't you give thanks rather to the gods for having enabled you to rise above everything that they've placed within your power, and having rendered you accountable only for what is subject to your control? So that's so powerful, isn't it? Because Epictetus is saying that we have been given the power to address every situation in which we find ourselves, one way or another. Rather than, complaining that our fathers or our brothers or our mothers or our sisters aren't how we might imagine they might be, we're actually equipped to deal with those situations, all of them.
So long as you accept things as they happen and you do not wish for them to be any other way than how they actually are, and you call those things good so that you can move towards them without any feeling of being coerced or anything like that. Simple. Well, 113 is quite short.
Let's do it.
Back to you, Courtney. What's going? Do you want to read or?
Is it me?
Well,
Didn't I just read?
Did you? I thought Travis read.
Yeah, it was me and then it was Travis.
Oh,
So it's
All
one
right,
of you
I'll do it.
guys.
I'll do it.
Okay.
113. How may everything be done in a way that is pleasing to the gods? When someone asked him, that'd be Epictetus, how one can eat in a manner that is pleasing to the gods, he replied, if one eats as one ought and politely, and indeed with temperance and restraint, won't one also be doing so in a manner that is pleasing to the gods? And when one has called for hot water and the slave boy fails to respond, or if he does, brings it merely lukewarm, or even if he isn't to be found in the house, and one doesn't get angry or lose one's temper, is that not pleasing to the gods? But how can one put up with such people? Slave, can't you put up with your own brother who has use for his father and is, so to speak, born of the same seed as you and is of the same heavenly descent? Or because you've been stationed in a somewhat more eminent position, will you set yourself up all at once as a tyrant? Won't you keep in mind who you are and who these people are whom you're ruling over, that they belong to the same family, that they are by nature brothers of yours, that they are offspring of Zeus? But I have right of purchase over them, and they don't have any such right over me. But don't you see to where it is that you're directing your view? That it is to the earth, to the pit, to these miserable laws of ours, the laws of the dead, so that you fail to have any regard for the laws of the gods. That's it. Well, this is a bit enigmatic, this one.
This is a really good one. Because I'm thinking as you started that it sounds a bit religious, really. He's going on about what pleases the gods, the slave doesn't turn up, isn't that you can't get angry at him because that would please the gods. But his reasoning is actually not very religious at all. It comes back again to the Stoic physics. Fundamentally, it's pleasing to the gods because status is a human invention. But fundamentally, we all are rational beings. That's what we are. It's undeniable. And we do not differ really in degree when it comes down to our potential capacity to act rationally. So it's really grounded in a natural way of seeing human beings, as opposed to something more mysterious and mystical. And he shows how, in fact, we kind of pervert natural law by inventing human laws that are only convenient for certain people whilst neglecting others. And it's a perversion. And it's not a perversion from that sort of Christian sense, because it has something to do with some sort of ungodly evil. It's because it neglects the nature of things. It's just an inversion, isn't it?
Yeah, and it's a brilliant. I think the whole thing with the hot water is just so brilliant because, how irritated do we get if the hot water doesn't come out of the tap the way we want it to, which of course is our equivalent of the slave who doesn't bring it or brings lukewarm water. It's just something's not right. We just, when we want that hot water, we really want that hot water. But here Epictetus is reminding us that it would be more pleasing to the gods if we didn't just get so annoyed about the hot water.
Even eating, like, it makes sense. It's practical and pleasing to the gods to exercise temperance and restraint. Because if you shoved food down your face and really stuffed yourself, it would actually be unhealthy, So it makes sense. That everything he's saying here kind of makes sense from a very physical point of view too. From the point of view of what we've been given by nature, obviously makes sense to eat in a more deliberate and careful way and slowly and thoughtfully and the like. Well, is that it? It's all over. You happy with that?
That was so good. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you,
So good.
everybody. Well, we won't start another one. We'll wrap it up. We did really well. We got through quite a few there. And
Yeah,
again,
and it doesn't, I don't think it matters, as we said before, Courtney, because I think it's so good. We can take the time and do it slowly, which is enriching for all of us.
yeah. And they're so illuminating. They're so interesting to share. Oh, looks like Judith got stuck.
Yeah. I mean, I've read it, I know, and I've read it patchily as well. So to have it done in this lovely continuity is really good because we're covering every bit of it,
And it's wonderful to hear everyone else's point of view. It's instead of hearing my own commentary in my head. Well, I think Judith got stuck. So
yeah, she did. She got stuck. All right.
Sorry,
Anyway,
Judith. Good night, Judith. Good night, Travis.
I'll have
Good night.
a listen. I'll have a listen to the Protagoras one.
Okay. Good night, guys. Bye.
Yeah. Good night. See ya.